The war drums of the Relzer Dominion had been beating for weeks, a slow, deliberate rhythm of impending annihilation. General William Henry stood in the dimly lit command room of Earth's last great military installation, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the holographic projection of the Sol system. Red markers bled across the screen, creeping toward Earth like a tide of destruction. "They're giving us one final chance to surrender," Commander Andrew Bernard said, his voice a controlled monotone, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. The message from the Relzer High Council hung in the stale air like the breath of a loaded gun. Henry exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping against the polished steel of the war table. "And if we don't," Bernard swallowed, "then they exterminate us." A silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of the station's generators. The Relzer had never been subtle. Their warships, monstrous obsidian leviathans, had darkened the skies over countless worlds. They had crushed civilizations, leaving nothing but sterile, burned husks in their wake. Earth was next. The holographic display flickered, and a towering alien figure materialized before them. Chancellor Vexi Enartok, his slitted eyes gleaming with a predatory arrogance. His voice, rich with disdain, reverberated through the room. "Humans, you stand on the precipice of extinction." His mandibles clicked in amusement. "Your species has been deemed inefficient. The Dominion will assume control of your planet, and those who surrender will be given the privilege of servitude. Resist, and you will cease to exist." General Henry folded his arms across his chest, unmoved. He had seen war, had watched men die, with their hands reaching toward a sky that had long since abandoned them. He had stood in the ruins of fallen cities, the acrid scent of burning flesh clawing at his lungs. He leaned forward, his voice quiet but cold as a gun barrel. "You come to my world. You threaten my people. And you think we'll roll over like beaten dogs?" He shook his head. "If you want war, we will give you nuclear war." A pause. Then laughter, deep, guttural, condescending. The Chancellor's mandibles spread in amusement. "Nuclear war," Enartok repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "A primitive threat from a primitive race." He tilted his head, as if indulging a child's tantrum. "Your crude weapons are meaningless against us. Surrender now, and we may yet allow your kind to serve in the Dominion." Henry felt the temperature in the room drop, not from fear, but from the sharp, calculated anger settling in his chest. He met the alien's gaze with something that wasn't defiance. It was certainty. "You don't understand humanity," he said. "You think we're weak because we don't seek war. But if you force us into a fight, we don't stop. We don't break. And we sure as hell don't surrender." The Chancellor's expression hardened. "Then you have chosen extinction." The transmission cut. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then Bernard exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Jesus, Bill. They were never going to let us surrender," Henry muttered. His mind was already moving to the next step, war maps unfolding in his thoughts. "I just wanted them to know what's coming." Colonel Mark Tyler, who had been standing near the edge of the room, finally spoke, his voice gravelly from years of barking orders. "Sir, we're not seriously considering full nuclear engagement, are we?" Henry turned to him. "We have no choice." Tyler shook his head. "It'll kill millions. It'll kill billions if we don't," Henry shot back. "We're fighting a force that doesn't know the meaning of mercy. The Relzer believe they're invincible. That's their weakness. They underestimate us." He gestured toward the holomap, where the red markers loomed closer. "And that will be their downfall." The command station vibrated. The distant thud of impact sent a ripple through the steel walls. A warning siren blared. "They've started," Bernard murmured, his face pale in the dim emergency lighting. Henry moved to the central console, bringing up the live feed from planetary surveillance. The sky above Earth was on fire. Relzer warships broke through the upper atmosphere, sleek and dark, their hulls illuminated by the glow of plasma bombardments. Cities erupted in flame as targeted strikes ripped through military installations. "We have 36 hours before full planetary occupation," Tyler reported. His voice was tight but steady. "We're already losing ground defenses in Europe and North America." Henry clenched his fists. He had fought his entire life to prevent wars like this. Yet here they were. He turned to Dr. Leonard Graf, the nuclear specialist who had remained quiet through the exchange. The scientist's eyes flicked toward the live footage, the devastation reflected in his glasses. "Can we do it?" Henry asked. Graf hesitated. He was not a soldier. He was a man who had dedicated his life to understanding the power of destruction in order to prevent it. But now, his knowledge would determine whether humanity survived. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Yes, we have enough warheads left to launch a full-scale nuclear counterattack." "But," he exhaled, "you understand what that means?" Henry did. They were past the point of half measures. Earth was already burning. If they were to die, they would take their enemies with them. "Prepare the launch sites," Henry ordered. Graf hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. Tyler exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This is insane." "No," Henry corrected. "This is war." Bernard straightened. "What's the plan?" Henry glanced at the burning world below. His mind was set, his path clear. "We hit them where it hurts," he said. "Every capital ship, every landing site, every stronghold they think is untouchable." He met Bernard's gaze. "We show them what happens when you push humanity to the edge." A tremor ran through the station as another impact rocked the hull. "Sir, Relzer troops have begun planetary deployment," a technician called from across the room. Henry stepped back from the table. The weight of his decision settled over him like a storm cloud, but he did not waver. The Relzer had come to wipe humanity from existence. They had no idea what they had unleashed. His voice was steady, unshaken. "Then let them burn." General William Henry stood at the Central Command console, watching as a feed from the eastern seaboard flickered on the screen. The cityscape was unrecognizable. New York had been reduced to craters and firestorms, its iconic skyline now twisted steel and shattered concrete. But amidst the devastation, resistance pockets still fought, the last remnants of Earth's defenses pushing back with everything they had left. A warning siren blared. Another impact trembled through the station as plasma rounds struck deep into the Earth's crust. Commander Andrew Bernard straightened, his fingers tightening over the edge of the control panel. "They're beginning full-scale occupation." Henry didn't react. His gaze remained fixed on the screens, his face as unmoving as stone. "Then we go to Phase 2. A silence stretched over the command center. The weight of those words sent an unspoken understanding through every man in the room. Colonel Mark Tyler exhaled sharply, his expression dark. He had always been a soldier who fought to protect, but tonight he would fight to annihilate. The order was given. Across the planet, launch silos unsealed themselves from hidden locations deep beneath the surface. Nuclear payloads, long thought to be relics of a past humanity had sworn never to use again, were primed and prepared. Generations had feared these weapons, monuments of destruction, whispered about in history books, condemned as the mistakes of a reckless age. But tonight, they were the last salvation. Dr. Leonard Graf's fingers hovered over the launch key. The scientist had dedicated his life to preventing global catastrophe. Now, his work was the very thing that would decide the fate of humanity. He turned to Henry, the weight of the moment reflected in his weary eyes. "Once we do this, there's no turning back." Henry didn't blink. There was never another path. Graf swallowed and turned the key. Deep within hidden bunkers across the globe, reinforced steel doors slid open, revealing the sleek, towering bodies of Earth's remaining nuclear arsenal. They erupted from their silos like dragons ascending into the heavens, leaving behind plumes of fire and smoke. The Relzer did not react at first. They had dismissed nuclear weaponry as primitive, an outdated relic from an inferior species. Their arrogance was their greatest flaw. The first detonation struck low-orbit command ships, vaporizing their hulls in a blinding white inferno. The second wave of warheads followed, their trajectories arcing toward the largest concentration of Relzer landing crafts and ground forces. Explosions rippled across the battlefield in chain reactions of devastation. Entire landing zones erased before the enemy had time to adapt. Panic rippled through the Relzer fleet. Admiral Cale Vorin stood aboard his flagship, his four-clawed hands gripping the edge of the tactical interface. His golden eyes flickered between the battlefield reports, struggling to comprehend what was happening. Humans were not supposed to be capable of this. Their weapons were supposed to be outdated, ineffective. And yet, before his very eyes, his battalions were being annihilated. Impossible, he growled. Chancellor Vexi Nartok's face flickered into view on the command channel, his mandibles snapping in irritation. Report, Admiral. What is happening down there? Vorin forced his voice to remain steady. They have responded with nuclear force. Our casualties are... He hesitated, unable to bring himself to say the number aloud. Significant. Nartok's slitted eyes narrowed. Then crush them. Their weapons are finite. Let them exhaust their last defenses before we eradicate what remains. The Chancellor cut the transmission. Vorin clenched his jaw. He knew what the Council refused to accept. The humans were not fighting to win. They were fighting to kill. And they would burn everything to do it. On the ground, the atmosphere was thick with radiation and fire. The Relzer advance had been staggered. The once coordinated assault lines were now fractured, their forces desperately attempting to regroup in the wake of the unrelenting nuclear strikes. But humanity was not done. In the remnants of Washington, amidst the skeletal remains of collapsed buildings, Henry and his strike team moved through the dust-choked streets. The air was heavy with smoke, every breath laced with the metallic tang of burned ozone. Bernard adjusted his rifle, glancing at the smoldering remains of an alien war machine, its massive, spider-like frame twisted from the blast impact. They didn't see this coming. That's why we have to keep pushing, Henry said. They'll recover fast. We have to make sure they don't get the chance. Tyler peered through his scope, scanning the ruins ahead. Movement 2 clicks north. Relzer recon units. Small squad. They're testing our defenses, Henry murmured. We hold here. Minutes passed in silence. The distant roar of collapsing buildings punctuated the eerie quiet. Then the enemy came. Relzer soldiers moved through the rubble with practiced efficiency, their elongated frames sleek and armored. They advanced with precision, their plasma weapons humming with an unnatural glow. Henry gave a silent signal. His men spread out, pressing into cover. The moment stretched, then snapped. Gunfire erupted. The first Relzer dropped before it could fire a shot, its elongated skull split apart by a sniper round. The rest reacted immediately, unleashing a barrage of plasma fire. Bolts of searing energy scorched the concrete, melting through steel and stone. Henry ducked behind the charred husk of a transport truck, his pulse steady, his mind clear. He broke cover, rifle raised. 3 shots, 3 kills. The Relzer fell in rapid succession, their bodies crumpling into the dust. Bernard fired alongside him, his expression grim, movements precise. The last alien warrior staggered back, clutching at the hole in its chest before collapsing. The silence returned. Tyler exhaled, reloading his weapon. This is only going to get worse. Henry nodded. That's why we make every second count. He turned his attention back to the skies. The nuclear strikes had given humanity a reprieve, but the Relzer were already adapting. More ships were descending, their formations tighter, more calculated. The Council would not accept defeat. A transmission crackled through the command line. General, you need to see this. Henry activated his communicator. The feed from Earth's orbital scanners came into view, and his breath stilled. The Relzer fleet was repositioning, but not to retreat. They were regrouping for something larger. More warships were arriving, reinforcing their numbers. This was not desperation. This was escalation. A new strategy. Bernard studied the display, his voice hushed. They're preparing for planetary siege. Tyler shook his head. We can't keep launching nukes forever. If they start hitting us from high orbit, we're finished. Graf's voice cut through the channel. Sir, we have one last option. It's not something I'd ever recommend, but given our situation. Henry didn't look away from the display. What is it? Graf hesitated. A full-scale nuclear detonation across the entire planet. A saturation effect. If we initiate the final launch sequence, we can make Earth uninhabitable. The words sank into the room like lead. Tyler exhaled sharply. You mean destroy the planet? Graf's voice was grim. We're already dying, Colonel. The question is, do we make sure they die with us? The weight of the decision pressed into Henry like 1,000 ghosts whispering at his back. His entire life had been spent preventing wars like this. And yet, now he stood on the precipice of annihilation, the future of humanity resting on a single command. He turned to the screen. The Relzer fleet was shifting, preparing. They thought they had broken humanity. They had no idea what was coming next. The sky was poisoned, thick with the ashen remnants of what had once been Earth's greatest cities. The once proud landscapes of civilization had been reduced to smoldering wastelands, the air itself laced with the scent of molten metal and scorched earth. But still, humanity endured. General William Henry stood at the edge of a ruined overpass, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where Relzer war machines lumbered through the ruins like shadows of death. They had learned. The nuclear fire had decimated their first wave, but they had adapted. Their ground forces now moved with caution, their shields calibrated against radiation, their forces pressing forward with unwavering efficiency. The bombardments had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was the quiet before the final storm. The wind carried the distant sound of gunfire, sporadic and desperate. The resistance was crumbling. Every minute brought another collapse, another outpost lost. Henry clenched his jaw. This was the moment where most armies would consider surrender. But surrender had never been an option. Commander Andrew Bernard crouched beside him, scanning through a cracked pair of binoculars. They're setting up artillery along the western perimeter, he muttered. They're preparing for the final push. Henry nodded, his face unreadable. The Relzer weren't interested in negotiation. They had no desire to conquer in the traditional sense. This was extermination, carried out with the cold precision of a species that saw humans as nothing more than insects beneath their boots. Colonel Mark Tyler stood nearby, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression hardened by exhaustion. We're running out of time, he said. We've hit them with everything we have, and they're still coming? We knew they would, Henry replied. But they still don't understand how far we're willing to go. Dr. Leonard Graf adjusted the cracked lens of his radiation visor, stepping carefully over the rubble. If we trigger the full-scale detonation, there won't be a planet left to fight over, he said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, an awareness of the irreversible decision they were about to make. Henry turned to him. How much time do we have? Graf exhaled. If we execute the sequence now, we have approximately 1 hour before full atmospheric collapse. The nuclear saturation will ensure no Relzer survive. And no humans, Tyler added darkly. A deep rumble rolled across the ground, shaking the remains of the overpass. In the distance, the alien artillery was activating, their long, insectoid barrels glowing with a sickly green energy. We don't have an hour, Bernard muttered. Henry studied the battlefield, his mind a flurry of calculations. Every decision carried the weight of extinction. But there was no alternative. The Relzer would not stop until there was nothing left to burn. He activated his comms, his voice unwavering. "This is General Henry to all remaining units. We are executing Protocol Zero." A long silence followed. Then the confirmations came, one after another. Graf inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his tablet as he initiated the sequence. All across the planet, hidden nuclear warheads activated, their launch mechanisms whirring to life. Deep beneath the surface, bunkers hummed with energy, countdowns beginning in silent synchronization. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it press against his chest. He had been a soldier his entire life, had seen men bleed and cities crumble, had stood in the aftermath of battles and questioned the cost of every decision. But there had never been a choice like this. Bernard exhaled beside him, his voice quieter than usual. "We're really doing this?" Henry nodded. "We make sure they regret ever stepping foot on this planet." Tyler shook his head with a dry, humorless chuckle. "Damn right." The Relzer advance continued, oblivious to the storm about to consume them. Their war machines pressed forward, their ground forces moving with mechanical precision. To them, this was already over. Then, the first sirens howled across the ruined cities. From the depths of the earth, missiles erupted. They streaked through the skies like spears of vengeance, their trajectories locked, their payloads primed for annihilation. The Relzer hesitated. For the first time, they hesitated. Admiral Cale Voren stood aboard his flagship, his golden eyes narrowing as the energy signatures registered across his fleet's instruments. His claws tightened over the edge of the command console. "Chancellor," he activated the emergency comms. "They're executing a planetary-wide detonation sequence." Vexi Nartok's image flickered to life, irritation in his slitted gaze. "Impossible. They wouldn't dare destroy their own world." "They would," Voren growled. "They just did." The first impact struck. A firestorm unlike anything in recorded history consumed the surface. Explosions bloomed across the continents in rapid succession, entire landscapes swallowed by waves of atomic energy. The Relzer war machines were obliterated, their shields failing against the sheer force of humanity's last desperate act. Cities crumbled beneath the pressure of the blasts. The oceans churned, vaporized into thick clouds of blackened steam. The sky itself began to darken, choked by the rising clouds of debris. The Relzer fleet attempted to pull back, but it was too late. In the span of minutes, Earth was transformed into a wasteland. Henry stood amidst the ruins of what had once been a city, the wind howling through the skeletal remains of skyscrapers. The air was thick with radiation, the sky a shifting sea of red and black. He adjusted his visor, scanning the wasteland before him. They had done it. They had won. But at what cost? Tyler coughed, adjusting the filtration mask over his face. "Christ," he muttered, looking over the endless expanse of destruction. "We actually did it." Bernard lowered his rifle, exhaling. "Never thought I'd live to see the end of the world." Graf was silent. He stared at the sky, watching as the last remnants of the Relzer fleet struggled to escape the collapsing atmosphere. They had no home left to conquer. Their forces had been shattered, their empire wounded beyond recognition. Henry turned his gaze skyward. Voren's fleet was retreating. They had not anticipated this. They had believed themselves superior, untouchable. But they had never faced a species that would rather destroy their own home than be conquered. Henry activated his comms one last time. "To the Relzer Dominion," he said, his voice raw but steady. "You thought we were weak. You thought we would break. You were wrong." The transmission was silent. Then a response. Voren's voice was strained, filled with something Henry had never heard from the alien before. Fear. "You would doom your entire world," Voren hissed. "Just to spite us." Henry exhaled. "Not spite. Survival." Another long pause. Then Voren's voice was softer, almost disbelieving. You are more monstrous than we ever imagined. Henry clenched his jaw. Now you understand. The line went dead. The wind howled through the empty city. Humanity had won, but there was nothing left to save. The silence was unbearable. It stretched across the ruined planet, heavier than the radiation-choked air, thicker than the soot-darkened sky. There were no more alarms, no more screams, no more distant thunder of collapsing cities. The earth had finally gone quiet. General William Henry stood atop the skeletal remains of a skyscraper, staring out across the frozen wasteland that had once been a civilization. The air was cold, far colder than it should have been. The detonation of hundreds of nuclear warheads had done more than eradicate the Relzer. It had shattered the very balance of the atmosphere. The sun, once a blinding beacon of life, was now barely visible through the blackened clouds. The world was dying, its final breath coming in long, frozen gasps. Commander Andrew Bernard approached from behind, his boots crunching against the brittle, irradiated debris. His face, once lined with determination, now carried something else, something hollow. "It's worse than we expected," he muttered, pulling his tattered coat tighter around his shoulders. Temperatures dropping faster than Graf predicted. The winter's already settling in. Henry didn't respond. He had known this would happen. They all had. But knowing and seeing were two different things. Down below, the few remaining soldiers moved through the ruins, like ghosts, wrapped in scavenged coats, their weapons slung loosely at their sides. They had won, and yet every single one of them carried the same empty expression, the same unspoken question lingering in their eyes. What was left? Colonel Mark Tyler leaned against a broken support beam, lighting the last of his cigarettes with shaky fingers. He exhaled slowly, the smoke barely visible in the freezing air. "Can't believe I'm still breathing," he muttered. "Figured if the nukes didn't kill us, the aliens would." Bernard shook his head. "Give it time. We might not be dead yet, but we sure as hell aren't living." Henry turned his gaze to the sky, watching the slow, desperate retreat of the remaining Relzer warships. The once invincible fleet, reduced to fractured remnants, was pulling away, limping back to whatever was left of their dominion. They had come expecting a slaughter. They had found one, but not the way they had imagined. A flickering transmission came through the cracked comm system. The static-laden voice of Admiral Cale Voren echoed through the ruined streets, filled with disbelief, perhaps even something bordering on reverence. "You would destroy your own world just to deny us victory. You truly are the most dangerous species we have ever encountered." Henry keyed the transmission, his voice as cold as the wind whipping through the ruins. "Now you understand." There was a pause. Then Voren spoke again, his voice a whisper. "This is not victory, human. You have only ensured your own extinction." The transmission cut. Henry exhaled, watching the last of the Relzer disappear beyond the horizon. He knew Voren was right. They had won, but there was no world left to rule. Dr. Leonard Graf stumbled toward them, his face gaunt, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "We have a problem," he said, wiping the soot from his cracked glasses. "The nuclear fallout is worse than expected. The sky's already choking the atmosphere. Temperatures will drop below freezing in a matter of days. We won't last the winter." Tyler let out a low chuckle, the sound bitter and sharp. "So that's it, huh? We won the war just to freeze to death." Henry remained quiet, his mind turning over the calculations, the possibilities. There had to be something. Bernard rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them. "There's still the underground bunkers. The old ones built during the Cold War. Some of them were designed for long-term survival." Graf hesitated. "That might buy us time, but even if we survived the winter, what comes after? We've poisoned the land. There's no agriculture, no infrastructure left. We might have survived the Relzer, but we've turned Earth into a tomb." Henry looked around, taking in the faces of the last men left standing. They had fought to the bitter end, refusing to kneel, refusing to surrender. And in doing so, they had ensured that there was nothing left but ruin. A distant explosion rattled through the dead city as a fuel reserve finally ignited, sending up one last plume of fire into the dark sky. The world was still burning, even as it turned to ice. Henry finally spoke. "We move to the bunkers. We survive." "For how long?" Bernard asked. "As long as it takes." There was no response to that. They all knew what it meant. They had defied extinction once. They would do it again. The survivors gathered what little supplies they could carry. Bernard led a team to scout ahead, while Tyler and a handful of others worked on reinforcing the bunker entrance. Graf muttered calculations under his breath, running radiation levels through his portable scanner. As they moved through the ruins, the last remnants of humanity, Henry took one final look at the horizon. In the distance, beyond the smoldering wreckage and the frozen fields of ash, the first flakes of nuclear snow had begun to fall. The Relzer had come believing humanity was weak. They had been wrong. They had come believing victory was inevitable. They had been wrong. And as the last of the warships vanished into the void, as the Earth slowly succumbed to the cold grip of the winter they had unleashed, Henry allowed himself one final thought. We are still here. And as long as humanity existed, there was always a chance. The war was over. The fight to survive had just begun,